Governor Rauner says he's not in charge, but he wants your help to change that. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. A lot of political things going on these days as the holiday season also approaches. With me today to talk about it, a couple of people who've been watching this for a long time. Mike Lawrence is here, former director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute in Carbondale, press secretary to Jim Edgar, and former reporter. All kinds of stuff, former. Right, Mike?
Right.
Right, here we are.
I'm not in charge of anything.
And we're going to talk about that. Kent Redfield is back. He is Professor Emeritus, Political Science, University of Illinois, Springfield, expert on campaign finance, and can't keep from being busy anyway. So yeah, welcome back. So the headline, and what have I got here? The Tribune, but it was all over the place. Governor Rauner was in Chicago. Had a press conference and was complaining again, as it turned out, about House Speaker Michael Madigan and how he's blocked certain things that the governor wanted, or many things that the governor wanted. And the quote was, "I'm not in charge, Speaker Madigan is," which was an odd political statement because generally I think Governor Rauner says things, I don't know if they're poll tested or if their staff tested, if they've talked about it, but he usually is very careful about picking his words. Was that a good thing for him to say? And then he doubled down on it the next day when asked, do you really mean this? He said, yes, because he blocks what I do, and we've got to get him out of the speakership, and we need to, have enough Republicans beat Democrats to make, or I guess have enough Democrats turn on their own leader so that he doesn't get another term as speaker. What do you think, Mike?
Well, to say the least, it was a remarkable comment. He's the first governor of Illinois I've heard say anything like that. It fits in a way with his overall theme that Madigan is blocking everything that he wants to do. But the governor of Illinois, by the state constitution, is one of the most powerful governors in the country structurally. And as I say, I don't think I've ever heard another Illinois governor say, I'm not in charge, even privately.
Yeah, Kent, what do you think? Of course, one of the writers of that Constitution in the 1970, one of the delegates, I think, was a guy named Mike Madigan.
Yes, yes, and I don't know whether it was a slip or not. I mean, you can argue that it kind of fits in this narrative of, but for Madigan, Illinois would be, heaven on earth. But it feeds into another narrative that's starting to build not only from the Democratic opponents but also from Rauner's primary opponent, is that the governor is incompetent, that he can't deliver, he can't do it, and for him to just in a sense sit there and whine that the bad old speaker is keeping me from getting things done is doesn't project a strength and competency. And so I can't believe that they sat there and thought about in some war room that this was the right way to go about it.
Well, Illinoisans historically have been far more pragmatic than ideological, and they want public officials who get things done. And so the Governor Rauner's statement, it would seem to me, would not be helpful to him as he runs for re-election.
Okay, well, as he did explain it, even on the first day, he said, well, but for the Speaker Madigan, we'd have 200,000 more jobs in Illinois. We'd have a better work climate. Of course, he is also assuming that, well, he has wanted so many changes in the power of unions and workers' compensation laws and things like that. Even without Madigan, we still have overwhelmingly majorities of Democrats in the House and Senate, and the governor's a Republican, and he did win election over a weakened Governor Pat Quinn. but it does seem that he hasn't come to terms with the frustration. Some of what has come out of this, you know, you mentioned his opponents. One statement that came out, I think it was the first day, President John Cullerton of the Senate put out a statement saying, well, I'm willing to work with the governor, and I'm willing to work if we don't have a governor, but the governor hasn't really met with the leaders, all four of us, since last December, so it's like a year, if I'm correct in that. And there's a state budget is supposed to be announced by the governor within, you know, a couple months, 70 days. So let's get to work. So, you know, that allowed that kind of subtle dig that why aren't you meeting with us? Why aren't you negotiating instead of, again, attacking? And I should say, at that first press conference where the governor mentioned that, you know, he's not in charge, he indicated he was berating the press for not saying Mike Madigan is backing J.B. Pritzker for governor. Madigan hasn't said so, but you know, there are indications about, with all the labor unions going, the governor says it's all a big plot. In fact, he said Madigan was running a mafia protection racket, quote unquote, to get his candidate elected in 2018, which again matches the kind of rhetoric that Governor Rauner's been using the entire time in office, even times traditionally after an election when you're supposed to be, people think, maybe people like Mike Lawrence think it's time to govern. And certainly your old boss, Jim Edgar, criticized Rauner for that a long time ago, and I don't think they've talked in more than a couple of years now.
It's been a while.
Yeah. So we'll see where that goes. Jean Ives also filed her petitions this week, and she's a Republican state representative from Wheaton, and basically is coming from the conservative side. One thing she did this week is she wants to repeal the Trust Act, which is keeps local police agencies in Illinois from turning people over to immigration authorities, federal authorities, just because of their immigration status, unless there's a warrant. But she, you know, put out statements, well, I'm running to be in charge. How is Jean Ives doing? She obviously, Kent will not have anywhere near the governor's money because he already put $50 million into his own campaign fund, and his friend Ken Griffin, the richest man in Illinois, put $20 million into it. Jean Ives is more in the, you know, hundreds of thousands so far.
Well, she definitely does need to get some money in order to get that message out there, but she's going to get attention, and you can see the themes. It's not just the narrow social conservative issues, you know, and one of the flashpoints was obviously the governor signing Senate Bill 40 that
House Bill 40, right?
House Bill 40 had to do with abortions, but in emphasizing the Trust Act, she's talking about immigration. 50% of the vote in Republican primary comes from downstate, south of the collar counties. Donald Trump did very well in southern Illinois, not so well in the rest of the state, but in downstate Illinois, he did very well. And so, you know, has Trump-like themes that she wants to go after. In addition to the competency question and the leadership question, then she's also going to be talking about things and trying to align herself with you know, Trump voters, whatever that means in terms of downstate Illinois.
Yeah.
So
now,
there's potential there.
Yeah. Now she, of course, hasn't been, that I'm aware of, doing any advertising yet. That's probably way off for someone as not highly funded as she is. But one of the things she did say in her kind of announcement speech in her hometown of Wheaton the night before she came to Springfield on Monday to file her petitions, you know, she talked about Rauner and kind of the tough-talking dude on a Harley with no social agenda turned out to be an empty Carhartt jacket, and she also called him an Ivy League gender studies professor, and Benedict Rauner. So you get the idea. She's, you know, mocking. She's talking in very negative ways about the governor of her party. But I have also heard talk, you know, Illinois, as you know, Mike, because you worked for one, has elected Republican governors who tend more toward the middle and are moderate on social issues. So is there some thought that Jean Ives can be a nuisance for Rauner to get through in the primary, but actually helps Rauner in the general because he will look more moderate versus where she stands for?
Well, I've heard that, and it's interesting speculation. But I'm sure that if Governor Rauner and his people had a choice, they'd just as soon not have her.
That's probably a good point.
Now, I do add to or go along with what Kent said. I think this is a good point about the Trump connection, because she is pretty much an unabashed supporter of Trump. And
although she doesn't. I mean, I have not seen her highlight it. Although,
well,
yeah.
I heard an extensive interview
Okay.
she had with the Chicago radio station, where she went on and on
Okay.
about how much she supports Trump, and she's running in the primary against a governor who almost never mentions the name of the president.
Yeah. Well,
now, you know, that doesn't mean that all the Trump people will be voting for her, or even if they all do, that base is still not big enough, even in a Republican primary. But I think she's going to be taken more seriously than some of the challengers in the past to sitting governors and moderate Republican governors. You know, she is a graduate of West Point, and
mother of 5. She says those,
yeah.
and a couple of her kids are in the military. At least one went through West Point as well. Yeah.
I've heard her interviewed, you know, several times. She handles her interviews well, particularly if reporters don't press her on details on how she's going to accomplish everything she talks about. But still, as I indicated earlier, I think, you know, she's a long shot to beat him in the primary. But I would say overall, he doesn't need another voice out there attacking him.
Yeah. One other difference is when asked about Roy Moore in the election coming up in Alabama, you know, obviously he's been accused and denied that he was inappropriate dating teenagers or what, you know, when he was in his 30s. The governor has said Roy Moore should step aside, which of course it's too late for that, but the governor has said that. And Gene Ives has said more than once, let's leave that up to the voters in Alabama. So there's a difference. You can judge that as you wish, but it's just between those two candidates. We'll see where it goes. On the other side, one of the other things that Governor Rauner did this week is he kind of took on the person considered perhaps the front runner, certainly in spending and visibility, J.B. Pritzker on the Democratic side, because Pritzker recently and Chris Kennedy put out some tax returns, and Pritzker showed that he made in, I think, 2015 or 16, like $15 million, but Forbes says he's worth $3.5 billion. So Governor Rauner, who is worth somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion, said that Pritzker is either a horrible investor to make that little money in a year, or he's hiding, you know, in trusts or in other places his worth, perhaps offshore, and so that would be a scandal. And then the governor was pressed. He doesn't control because he said it was in blind trust. It's actually power of attorney handles it for him. And he said, well, all the banks have some instruments with probably something in, you know, offshore, but it's really little and I don't have any control. Kent, who wins this argument in the public eye?
Well, this argument helps Biss, the other, you know,
Daniel
Biss,
who
one
was
of
the
the
state senator from Evanston, who keeps
doesn't
saying,
have,
let's not have an auction, let's have an election, although
right.
I'm not sure, you know, how well he's doing out there.
So it does help Biss, because if he wants to differentiate himself between, you know, I'm the person that isn't a millionaire or a multi-billionaire, and I'm, you know, more a man of the people, you know, as much as a college professor from Evanston can be, you know, a man of the, you know, the working class and all of that.
At age 25, he was a math professor, wasn't he? At University of Chicago, so he's kind of done amazing things himself.
Yeah, but if between Rauner and Pritzker, an argument about who's spent their money or made the most money, or who's invested the, you know, in the best way, that's a wash. You know, we should, I mean, we'll just stipulate, you know, people that have hundreds of millions or billions of dollars are different than everybody else, certainly everybody at this table. They can hire very, very smart people who can reduce their tax liability. Short of showing that some of this is illegal, then then we can argue about morally or anything else. If I were Pritzker in this debate, I would say, we're both very rich, but let's look at our tax policies. I want a progressive income tax that will take a lot more of my money, and Rauner is not for a progressive income tax.
In fact, he started a campaign against that. Those Democrats all want, because all the main Democrats in the race want a progressive income tax, which would take a constitutional amendment, so it would be a while to get there. And they say it would help, middle class people, and the rich would pay more. But Rauner says that's taking more tax money, and also, would be bad for bringing business to Illinois.
And this doesn't seem like a very productive thing for the governor, if in terms of finding that key issue that everybody's going to care about is who's got the better offshore accounts or the better tax lawyer is probably not a good argument.
Well, back to state government for a minute. One of the things the Rauner administration recently did was reach contract agreement with 7 companies to handle managed care for Medicaid, and it is said that I think over 4 years the expenditure will be like $63 billion. It's like the biggest contracts put out at one time. But there was another side contract that helps kind of implement some of the changes in Medicaid to get people in managed care, which is supposed to be a money saver over time, even though the amount overall of spending has been growing over the last few years. The Rauner administration talked about like $10 billion a year maybe, and then it turned out to be about 15. So, and Democrats in the legislature have been having hearings about that. But there's a consultancy called the McKinsey & Company that had a $12.9 million contract dealing with the Medicaid conversion. And Ellen Daly is the chief procurement officer for, I believe, agencies under the governor, and came out with a ruling saying that that contract should have been bid because it really deals with technical details like a regular contract that should have been bid. It wasn't, the wording used on it was to fight potential legal entanglements or something, or lawsuits, but she said that really didn't define it well, so she voided the contract. And then Rauner kind of accused Mike Madigan of having something to do with Ellen Daly's decision on this, which shows that he wants to blame her for everything. And then Comptroller Mendoza said, well, this McKinsey company had another contract that was put out a year ago for more than $12 million, and I think they've paid like $6 on that, but they quit paying on that for the same reason. So what have we got here? Is this unusual, and is this just a matter of frustration, or oddly, the procurement officer was acting under a law signed by the governor to tighten up the procurement process?
Well, I'd like to know more about it before I make a judgment, but in a broader sense, this could slow the movement towards managed care for Medicaid recipients.
Millions of them.
And the fact of the matter is, managed care is the way the state is headed, and it's headed that way because it should, in the long haul, help curb spending on Medicaid. So to the extent that this raises questions, slows things down, it may be an appropriate thing to review, but it is going to impede progress toward getting more Medicaid recipients under managed care.
And there will be a political dimension to this. There's absolutely no question.
In Illinois?
And so we've got a contract that the professional, the person that's supposed to be monitoring these things, looks at and says, this should have been a no bid. This should have been bid, and it's a no bid contract, and that's a sweetheart deal. And so again, fast forward to the general election, and it's Pritzker and Rauner says,
don't tell Kennedy you said that, but anyway.
Yeah, but I mean, let's just assume, and Rauner is saying, well, my opponent talked to Rod Blagojevich. And you can just see Pritzker coming back immediately. Yes, but my opponent is acting like Rod Blagojevich. Look at this sweetheart no-bid contract. And that's the sort of thing that he railed against, and we need to clean up government. And so it's not helpful to the governor, assuming that, you know, it looked pretty straightforward that it should have been, the contract should have been bid. And that's, you know, that feeds back into the narrative when Rauner says, well, we need, you know, no more of this old politics. You know, we need to shake things up. And then well, but what about the sweetheart contract? What about the inside deals? And here we go back into, you know, that kind of narrative. I don't know if that helps the voter much, but you're going to have a lot of political consultants spend a lot of time trying to see how they can work that to their advantage.
Indeed. We had some court action actually in Sangamon County in Springfield this last week. There was a first hearing on a case brought by various interest groups, legislators, and the Thomas More Society, which seeks religious freedom and is particularly for like pro-life kinds of issues. And that House Bill 40 that is supposed to take effect at the beginning of the year to allow Medicaid-funded abortions and state insurance to pay for more abortions, that the governor signed after saying he would veto it. And there's this lawsuit brought by various people, and they're trying to get the law blocked before it's implemented at the first of the year. Peter Breen is a state legislator, but he's also a lawyer for the Thomas More Society, and the lawsuit actually argues not that abortion is wrong, but that this was passed after the budget was passed. The state doesn't have enough money. There's no appropriation for any of these things, so it should not be implemented. Is that reasonable? How do you think a court will go, or do we want to predict what a judge will do?
Well, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, and I'm not a judge, but I don't see this getting very far on that argument. But I found it interesting to hear Representative Breen and some of the others arguing that, you know, this money that will go to pay for abortions for poor people is going to take money away from universities and other sources, when a lot of these folks who are involved either directly or are supporting this lawsuit haven't had a problem with cutting funding for universities and cutting funding for other needs and holding out for a long period of time on budgets that would have allowed for money to flow more regularly to the universities.
Yeah, it focuses the issue, keeps it in the newspapers. That's certainly helpful to Representative Ives in terms of what she wants to be doing. Now, the arguments have to do with interpreting the constitutional mandates in terms of your appropriations are supposed to match your revenues, and whether you've got a correct revenue estimate, and the language in the Constitution is soft enough. Mm-hmm. There are weasel words in there that allow you to if the legislature acts, generally the courts are very reluctant to go beyond the signatures of the constitutional officers, the Speaker and the Senate President, that we've kind of complied with everything. Now, certainly the courts have thrown out some laws when everybody assumed that you could be pretty fast and loose with mixing more than one subject together, until the court came in and threw out a bill that had leaking underground storage tanks and some social program mixed together, and the court said no. When it says single subject, it would mean single subject. So you never want to predict what the court's going to do, right. But precedent would indicate it's probably not going anywhere, but it does
keeps the issue out there.
Keeps the issue out there.
Right. Interesting. On the last day of filing, which was December 4th, the Monday, State Senator Sam McCann, who is interesting because he is very socially conservative, but over his years in the Senate, and I think he first got elected in 2010, because there are so many state employees in his district, he has tended to side on labor issues with them, including one. He voted for a bill that would allow arbitration to settle a contract between the Rauner administration and the largest state employees union, AFSCME. That bill was vetoed. It was not overridden. The governor supported a candidate against Sam McCann in 2016 in the primary. McCann overcame millions of dollars of opposition and terrible ads on TV and won that race. This year, Sangamon County, which is a big part of the 50th Senate District, endorsed Steve Mcclure, whose father, also named Steve, worked in the Thompson administration, but Steve is a former county prosecutor for state senate. And Sam McCann announced on the last day of filing that he is not running as a Republican. He doesn't recognize the Republican Party. It's a party that now hurts working people, et cetera, and there were some other complaints he had with it. But this does leave open the possibility, and he hasn't said what his next step is, of possibly running as an independent, either for Senate or governor. Do we think Sam McCann would do either of those things, or is there any way to predict?
Well, I'm not a confidant of Sam McCann. Most of what I know about him I get from reading your column and your news stories. But as far as the governorship is concerned, that takes an unusual number of signatures.
Right, it would take 25,000 instead of 5,000 to run as an independent. There's a very high bar.
It is a high bar, and sometimes candidates who want to look at going that route overlook that requirement, and they end up sometimes announcing they're going to run and then dropping out.
Well, and at this point, of course, it's all speculation because we don't know if Sam will do that. But there was speculation a few years ago. There were actually petitions put out for him to run for governor as an independent, and then he didn't. And then he kind of said he never, But there were people said that there were petitions that they were circulating. At least it seemed to be with his agreement. So you don't know. Stranger things have happened, right?
Stranger things have happened.
But he could run,
it certainly is possible he could run as an independent, but it would take some organizational strength, and so I think that's probably not likely.
Okay.
Now, it is interesting to note that when the governor complains about Speaker Madigan, rigging primaries, then we've got this huge amount of Republican money, all that came from Governor Rauner that is working on the Republican
there'll be plenty of money on all sides, and we will see. Mike Lawrence, Kent Redfield, thank you. Thank you for watching. I'm Bernie Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.